Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video we're going to be talking about starting new Photoshop documents inside of Photoshop CC 2018, as well as opening up files on your computer in order to edit. So as you can see from the main interface of Photoshop CC 2018, we have a grid-based display, but can also be a detailed list-based display on any files we've previously opened, files that we were previously working on. If we want to open up a file on our computer, which can be a Photoshop document or just an image file, we would go over here on the left and hit Open. Another way to use Open at any time is to go to the File menu and hit Open or hit Ctrl-O on your keyboard. So when we hit Open, it's going to give us the Windows File Explorer, which will allow us to choose either an image or a Photoshop document from our computer. Once we find something, these would be images of .jpeg, .png, similar file formats, or .pst for Photoshop document. But once we find the file we want to open up and edit, we just select it here and click Open at the bottom of this pop-up window. From there, the image is going to be loaded into Photoshop and we'll be able to edit it. Now you might notice on this tab it says .jpeg, so we're still working with a copy of the image, but this actually isn't saved to a Photoshop file yet. If we want to save this image as a file we can later edit, it's a good idea to go up to the File menu and choose Save As, or hit Shift-Control-S on your keyboard. Specify a location on your computer. Change Save As type to PSD or Photoshop document file. So by saving it as a Photoshop document, you'll be able to make changes to any edits you did within Photoshop when you later open it up. So normally if you export as a .jpeg or PNG image, all of those changes then become final. But if you save it as a Photoshop document, you can make changes to any changes you previously made. So it's a really good idea to save your work inside of a Photoshop document file if you still intend to continue working on that. So here I'm just going to overwrite this PSD file. Now the other alternative, if we want to start completely from scratch, we can click the Create New button here, or if we already have an image loaded up, for instance, if we have this gloomy image loaded, we can get the same menu by going to File and then New, or hitting Ctrl-N on our keyboard as a shortcut. That's going to pop us up with this new document window. Now, you'll have this default Photoshop size here out of the box, which is 7 by 5 inches at 300 pixels per inch. So this resolution of pixels per inch, which means as a digital format, there's going to be 300 pixels for every inch of width. So really, this is saying the Photoshop document size is 2100 pixels wide by 1500 pixels high. You just basically take these small numbers and multiply them by the resolution. Now, that would be what you'd want to use if you intend to actually print your document out to a physical piece of paper in the real world, right? But if you're only working digitally and you only care about the digital resolution right now, you can click on this menu and go to Pixels, where you can specify the exact pixel resolution, which is more relevant to your computer screen because your computer screen displays in terms of pixels. So by switching over to pixels, we have the same total resolution here, where it's 2100 pixels wide, 1500 pixels high. Let's say, though, you wanted to change it to something like 1080 resolution, or 1080p or I resolution. That would be 1920 pixels by 1080, really good for things like YouTube thumbnails or video production. So with those settings changed, we can actually go ahead and set a new preset so that we don't have to manually edit it every single time. To do that, we simply come up here where it says Untitled 1, we delete that text, we give it a new name, let's say 1000p thumbnail. So we'll start typing a new name, and we could say 1080p thumbnail, or you could change that to video, whatever you want to call the preset. And then we click the Save button over here on the right. So here I'm going to type in the same name as before, 1080p thumbnail, and we'll hit Save Preset. So what that's going to do is you'll have this new Saved tab over here where any custom presets you've made are just going to pop up here. So anytime now that you want to start a new document with this preset, you just come over here to the Saved tab, you click on that, and you'll be able to get started right away. There's also other presets that are defaulted down inside of Photoshop. If you click Photo, you get these different options for landscape and portrait photos. You have print sizes, which would be more like regular office printer paper. Art and illustration. Web design over here. Mobile, if you are doing work that's related to, let's say, a mobile application. And then film and video sizes, just like the 1080p that we put over here. Just like the 1080p thumbnail custom preset that we set over there. So anyway, once you found a preset that you like, all you need to do is select it and then click Create at the bottom right-hand corner. And this will give you a blank white document that we can start editing in. So once again, I'm going to recommend that with any new document, you go to File, Save As, and save it as a new Photoshop document file. So make sure the Save As type is set to Photoshop or .psd. And we can give it a name here, since we don't want the default name. So I will say Test Document, and we'll hit Save. Now I want to show you one other way to bring an image in. If you're already working in a Photoshop document, but you want to add a new image onto your document, you're going to want to open up the folder where your image is stored on your computer. So in this case, it's my pictures directory inside of my user profile. So I'll take this books image and we'll just drop it right in. So what you'll see is that it gives us basically controls to manipulate and adjust the size of this image. We can drag it around, and you'll notice that as we get to the center or any of the edges, where the edges kind of line up, you'll get these purple lines, meaning that it's automatically snapping to either the center, the vertical center, or the left, right, top, bottom edges. Also note that there's this panel in the bottom right section called Layers there by default, where this new image is actually being put on its own separate layer. Now, we won't talk too much about that right now. Just note that a Photoshop document is composed of many different layers, and changes that you make on one layer do not affect changes you make on other layers. So if you make a lot of changes, you can keep them separate from each other, and anytime you decide one of those changes doesn't belong in the final product, you can delete the layer entirely, or make changes only on the layer where you wanted to change things around a second time. Now, if I wanted to take this image and stretch it to the full size of this document, I can grab on either the middle sides or any of the corners of the document and stretch it. So I could stretch here where the image is a bit bent out of shape, but it would perfectly match the actual size of the document. Or if I click on one of the corners and stretch both the width and height at the same time, I can keep the ratio more in line. If you want to have a perfect ratio, you should hit Shift. So note that while you're holding Shift down and you pull on these corners, that it's actually maintaining the ratio perfectly. So I could stretch that to the right-hand side. And now if I want to make sure that that gets centered still, I just drag it up until we get that purple line. And now it's centered here. Now, how you want to actually integrate your images into your Photoshop document, that's up to you. If you're going to be importing an image straight in and you want to be editing on top of that image, I do recommend you open the image instead with File Open. But in this case, let's just say that we wanted to keep the same ratio, but we wanted to focus the image on what's important. So I'll pull this up until it snaps to the bottom because we want to have that door fully in the Photoshop document. And hit OK. So now that image is loaded in here as one of the layers in our document. The important part is still showing, and although part got cut off because the image size didn't perfectly match our Photoshop document size, we still have the image loaded into the document. So that's good. We can hit Control-S to overwrite the Photoshop document that we saved earlier, or you can go to File, Save As to save it to a new location. Here, I'm just going to leave Maximize Compatibility checked and hit OK. But to show loading this image up into its own brand new document, I'm going to go to File, Open, and we'll just choose this Books. So now we have the proper size for that image loaded into its own document, since the document gets created at the size of the image that we load up. To show that it's the right size there, we can go to the image menu at the top, choose canvas size, and if we change these over to pixels, you'll notice it's the same size as the actual image. To show that, I'll right-click on the item in the Windows File Explorer, go down to Properties, Details, and you can see that the size of both this document and the image we loaded in perfectly match up. So that's the basics of starting a new document inside of Photoshop CC 2018 and loading one of your images into that document, or loading one of the images as the document itself. I hope this tutorial has been helpful for you guys. I've been Chris, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in my future Photoshop content. Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I wanted to show you the main interface of Adobe Photoshop 2018 and explain essentially everything you see on screen right now, which is the default Essentials layout. Now, there are other windows you can pop open inside of Adobe Photoshop, but for most people getting started out, this is what you're going to be working with, and this is what you're going to be seeing. So the first panel over here on the left is called the Tools panel, aptly named because everything on this list is a utility that you can interact with your image or photo in some way. So on the left, the tools we're talking about are things like pencil tools, brush tools, erasers, paint buckets, gradients, which is where you shift from one color to another color slowly over a short distance. Gradients, which are a gradual blend between colors in a section of your Photoshop document. Selection tools, namely the rectangular marquee tool, and if we right-click over here, you can also see elliptical marquee tool. Anytime you have one of these tiny triangles in the bottom right-hand corner, you can actually right-click it to show more options that are available for you. And almost every item on this list has one of those corner triangles, so you have a lot of tools over here, a lot more than it might initially look. In later videos, we'll be going into more details about what these tools do and how to use them. At a basic level, you just kind of select a tool, you choose the settings up here in the Options window, and then you're going to be able to interact with your document in some way. So like, for instance, with the brush tool, we can go up here to the Options panel, change the size of the brush, and start drawing on top of whichever layer we have currently selected over here. So the next section is the Options window, where whenever you have a tool selected, it's going to give you different options from the size of that tool. Basically, bigger size means it's going to influence a bigger portion of your document. Other options, depending on what tool you have selected, might include changing the type of gradient. So a linear gradient might look like this, but if you go to a radial gradient, you get a completely different result by using it. Now, of course, we're not really going to talk about all of these options in this video, but just know that whenever you have a tool selected and you want to change the options, you do so up here in the Options window. In the bottom right-hand corner, we have the Layers panel, and the Layers panel is really useful because when you're working in a Photoshop document, basically whenever you have Photoshop open, you can separate your work into different layers. So, as I've been making this quick tutorial, we have a few different layers already. So if I actually disable this layer 2, which you can see in the preview window there, shows basically what data this layer contains, but if I hide that, we only get the image, which was the initial Photoshop document behind, because this layer is now disabled, but the original image is still there. So even if we're drawing on top of an image, as long as we do so on a separate layer, it doesn't actually cause any permanent damage to the image behind it. So by using layers, we get way more ability to undo changes that we decide we don't want in the end scene. Using layers is going to be one of the most important things to keep in mind as we go forward in these tutorials. You might also notice that there's two more tabs in this Layers window, including Channels, where by default we're looking at RGB, all of the red, green, and blue color in our image combined. But if we want to see only the areas in our image that actually have red, we can click here. Now it doesn't show it as red, it actually shows it in black and white, but where it's white or lighter colors, that represents there being more red in the image. We can also change it to green channel, where we see only the areas that have green, and blue, where we see only the areas that have blues. The third tab is called Paths, which there's nothing in there right now because we haven't done anything with the Pen tool. The Pen tool can be selected from the Tools panel over on the left, and if we click that and we start clicking around on our image, it's going to create what's called a path. Now, paths allow you to do many things, like to cut out part of your image if you wanted to select the area inside of the path, or you can right-click once you've created a path and actually fill it up with a specific color. So here it's selecting contents foreground color, which is going to be the color is selected over here in the Tools panel. If we hit OK, that path we just created gets filled up with that color. So there's going to be other ways we can apply the pen tool on paths, but we'll talk about that later on as well. And in the Properties panel, we can define certain attributes or properties about the layer we have currently selected. So you can see here, layer 1 is a text layer, indicated by the T here. So if we actually clicked on that, we'd be able to do things like change the font or the font size of the text within that layer. Now, I don't think I've actually defined any text here. We can do a quick demonstration though. So here I've gone ahead and already created a new text layer. We can see that it's defined with the test layer. And if we want to change anything about that, one of the properties, we can go over here and do something like, let's say, choose a new font, like Big Noodle Titling, or we could change the font color, possibly over to a deep red. And if we click the Advanced button here, we'll get additional settings that we can use to further define our layer. Another panel that pops up with properties is called Adjustments, and here what we can do is we can make changes to an entire layer with one of these tools. So for instance, brightness, contrast, we could increase the contrast or the brightness or decrease them inside of our layer. Or we could use Photo Filter to apply a new look to a photo we've imported into Photoshop. So for instance, if we were to apply a photo filter to the background layer which contains the image we've imported into Photoshop, then we'll get a different look in the image. And we can increase this effect so that it's very obvious by increasing the density here. And you can see by changing it with a warming filter, the image looks dramatically different, just like the filters you might use in one of your Android or iOS mobile apps. We also have the Color panel above Properties, which allows us to select colors. Now, we don't have to use this to select colors. We can also just click on the foreground color or the background color down here in the Tools panel. And we basically get the same selection tools here as well, just another place to do the same thing. But we also have color swatches, which will contain many of the typical colors you might want to use while you edit some of your PSD files. Now, you can actually add in different color swatch palettes into here. That's really all it is. It's a collection of colors. But this is just the one that exists by default. Now, lastly, over on the far right, we have libraries. Because Photoshop 2018 is part of the Creative Cloud package, of course, Photoshop CC for Creative Cloud 2018, you can actually use Adobe's Creative Cloud to manage your files, upload them to the Creative Cloud servers, and to edit files from there, as well as download them to your computer that you're currently working on. Now, this does require you to install the Creative Cloud application, which is optional. But if you have it up and running on your computer, then what you might see here are all of the files that are contained inside of your Photoshop Cloud. So whether you want to store your files up on the cloud or your computer, or to even use a third-party cloud service like Google Drive or Microsoft OneDrive, it's totally up to you where you want to store your files. So that's the basic interface inside of Photoshop CC 2018. A lot of these tools are going to be the ones we primarily deal with, but there is a lot more hidden complexity inside of Photoshop if you want to take it to the next level and really learn everything that the application can do for you. But for this video, that's going to be it. So I've been Chris, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in my future Photoshop content. Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video we're going to be talking about the pen tool, the pencil tool, and the brush tool, and comparing them within Photoshop. So, over on the left-hand side of the Tools window, you have access to both the brush tool, the pencil tool, and then down here, a little bit lower, the pen tool. They all do different things, but can be used for basically drawing on your Photoshop documents. So I'm going to zoom in here a bit so that we can really see what happens when I use, let's say, the pencil tool to get started. I'm going to increase the size here in the options window, and then we're going to draw a little bit. So I'm creating these different sections made with the pencil tool. And if we look really closely, what you'll notice is that no matter where the pixel is that we've created, it has 100% opacity, meaning it's not transparent at all, and it has the exact same color as even the parts that are closest to the center. So when you are working with a pencil tool inside of Photoshop, your edges are considered to be hard, which means that there's no smoothing out as it gets closer to the edge, where it would transition back into the white area of the original background color. It's simply that whatever areas get hit by this pencil tool are going to have 100% of the color which we are using, and that would be the foreground color over here, selected in the tools window as well. Now the brush tool is very different. If we click over here to see the sizing for the tool, you'll notice that there's both a hardness setting and a lot of different smoother brushes that we can use. So with each of these different tools, and you notice that hard round is actually the pencil tool, 100% hardness is essentially pencil tool. But for all the other options, as you get away from the center, it's going to smooth out. So if we take one of these brush strokes, so this is 20% hardness. So next up, the pencil tool. When you use this tool, you can have semi-hard edges, but you will never get an edge that's as hard and completely clear-cut as the pencil tool. So here we have hard round, which is using 100% hardness, but you'll notice when we actually do this, it's still significantly smoother than the pencil tool. Because when we zoom in really close, even 100% hardness is not really 100% hardness. There's a little bit of that transition back to the base color, where on the outer edges it doesn't 100% apply the color. Here maybe you have 50% of the gray, and then 25% of the gray, and then 0% of the gray. In many contexts, we would refer to this as anti-aliasing, which is a good thing. If you compare how this looks with the hard brush stroke, compared to when you do it with a pencil, it's significantly smoother, and in terms of creating good-looking artwork, it goes a long way. Now, a brush stroke doesn't have to be that level of hardness. You can go a lot further down. So at soft round, 0% hardness, it might look something like this, where it's very, very blurry, because there is a lot of that anti-aliasing. There's a huge number of pixels as it transitions from the center 100% black color to the outer white edges. So as you might expect, if you go any hardness setting in between, you're going to get less of that smoothing, blurred anti-aliasing as you increase the hardness. So at 50% hardness or so, it looks like this. 75%, you might get like this. Now, both tools are useful depending on the context of what you're trying to create. If you're looking for that absolute hard edge, you go with the pencil tool. But I believe in most cases, you're working in Photoshop, you're probably going to use the brush stroke with at least a significant portion of hardness, because you usually are going to want at least a little bit of that smoothness when you do your Photoshop documents, editing images, or doing graphic design. So that brings us to the pen tool, which, although it's called pen, is actually radically different than the brush and pencil. You would think it's, just part of your standard toolkit. But what you actually do with the pen tool is you define a path. And once you've defined that path, you can interact with it. So you left-click to add path points, and whenever you start creating new points, it's going to draw lines between them. Now, it doesn't need to be a straight line. If you left-click and then hold, you can actually create curves between the points. So, depending on how you manipulate this and change the handles, you can create some really wonky-looking paths. So the advantage to using the pen tool is that you get more control over what you're trying to do than any other tool here. So for right now, I'm just going to complete this path. And now what we can do is things like right-click, go to Fill Path if we want to fill that area that we've closed off with a singular color. We can stroke the path, which is where you basically draw actual data on top of the path. So using the pencil tool or the brush tool are options here, but you can also use less common tools as well. So let's do a brush stroke all along the path. Now, you may want to go into the brush settings before you do that, and let's say lower the size of the brush significantly. So let's try that again. Brush stroke, and then we get that. A perfect brush stroke drawn along the path. It's even possible to do more advanced stuff, like take the path and then make your text apply onto that path. So how we would do that is we can take this text that we've typed in here. I'm just going to cut it. And the easiest way is if we hover over the path line, which you can always go over to the paths panel and select it again if it goes invisible or anything like that, is to select the line where you'll have this series of dots indicating a path where you're going to be typing the text onto. And now you'll notice that the text entering blinking icon is actually conforming to the path. So if we Control V to paste that in, what you'll notice now is that this text is actually moving right along that path. So if I disable everything else, we can kind of see that the text just moves with the path. So that's pretty cool. Now, most likely you'll get better results if you do this when you have a curve rather than very hard, janky edges. But hopefully that gives you a quick idea about how you can at least use the pen tool in interesting ways. So hopefully, if you're taking anything away from this video, note that the pencil tool is for absolute hard edges with zero anti-aliasing. Brushes allow you to have smoother edges, leading up to just shy of the pencil level of hardness. And then the pen tool is actually about creating paths, which you can fill the shape in, you can stroke along the path, or you can do other things like type text along that path. So that's going to be it for this video, comparing those three different tools. I've been Chris, and I will see you guys in my future Photoshop content. Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to draw straight lines and to use guides within Photoshop. So in order to draw a straight line whenever you have a pencil tool or a brush tool selected over here on the left, normally you draw and it's kind of freehand. But if you have that tool selected and you hold Shift down while you're drawing with either your tablet or your mouse, it's going to give you a perfectly straight line in the direction you start in. So we can do the same thing starting from the left and going over to the right, getting a perfectly straight line there. And if we switch over to the pencil tool, we can get the same kind of results. Now that's all well and good if you need to approximate where that line's going to go. But if you need absolute precision, like if you're doing web design, then you should probably have guides set up. So in order to add guides, which we can snap to whenever we use the brush or the pencil tool, we go up to the View menu at the top, and we choose New Guide from the bottom. You can also click the drop down and go to New Guide Layout if you want to have a set of guides for a specific purpose. And you can save these guide layouts as presets, and you can also load them up from other places. So that is a really quick way to get started if you need a specific setup. But if you just want to add a single guide, we choose View and New Guide from the drop-down menu. You can choose either horizontal or vertical. Now by default, this guide is going to be in inches because that's also what our ruler, which is currently invisible, is set to. So if we want to change that, we can show the ruler by hitting Ctrl-R or using the View menu. We can right-click on the ruler and change it over to pixels instead of inches. Now if we go back into the new guide layout, it's going to give us the position in terms of pixels. And if we know how many pixels are in our document, so here it's 1920 pixels wide by 1080 pixels low, we can just do some simple math in order to, say, get it in the center of the document. So 1/2 of 1920 is going to be 960 pixels. And if I hit OK here, we have a vertical line going top to bottom, but it's moved over 960 pixels, creating us a perfect guideline that's halfway across the document. So we can do the same thing as well with horizontal guidelines. So 1080 divided by 2 is going to be 540 pixels. So there we get a horizontal line. Now you might notice these guidelines we've created are at the center of the document, which means that by default, if you're moving layers or images around, you can already snap to those inside of Photoshop, but you can't actually snap a brush or pencil stroke without having these guidelines. So now that we have these guidelines, we can snap to the guidelines if we enable it. So in order to enable guide snapping, we go to View, Snap to, Guides, but it looks like it's already enabled here, so we don't need to worry about that here. And now if we use a white color with the pencil tool and drag across, it's going to automatically snap here. So note that I'm not holding the Shift button down at all. Now to show a comparison, I'll just try to draw a straight line freehand with the mouse. And let's go down a little bit. And you can see, whoops, you can see that you're going to run into some issues if you don't have any snapping enabled. So once again, we'll try to draw a straight line on this vertical guideline. Note that my mouse is wavering a bit, but overall it's still doing a pretty good job there. We can use the eraser tool to fix any minor mistakes we might make though. Here I'll just erase that bit. and we'll continue drawing with the pencil tool. And there you go. Now, of course, you can create the guidelines at any point you want, so it doesn't need to be any particular multiple of the base document size. You could just do 250 pixels. And start drawing down that again. Probably easier to do this with a drawing tablet, by the way, than a mouse, but that's what I'm working with right now. And as you can see, the guidelines will go a long way in helping you to draw straight, but also you can snap images to these guidelines. So if you needed to frame an image that you bring in perfectly within your document, maybe for web design, then these guidelines will really help you out a lot. So that's the basics of using guidelines and drawing straight lines inside of Photoshop CC 2018. So I hope this video has helped you out. I've been Chris, and I will see you guys in my future Photoshop content. Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I'm going to be showing you guys everything you need to know about gradients inside of Photoshop CC 2018. So first off, getting started. The gradients option is available over on the left hand side, the tools window. If you see a paint bucket, you need to right click that. And it's going to give you this drop-down list where you can select either the gradient tool, the paint bucket tool, or the 3D material drop tool. So the gradient tool has this little icon here. If you see that, you just need to left-click on this button, but in any case, make sure you have the gradient tool selected. And the difference between the gradient tool and the paint bucket tool is when we use the paint bucket, it applies one solid color over whatever we have selected. But if we apply a gradient, it's going to transition between whichever colors we have selected up here from the starting point to the ending point. So we'll get started here by doing a linear gradient. You can see that there's different types of gradients available here. We'll talk about those in a bit. And I'll select the top left-hand one, which is not actually those two colors, but rather foreground to background color. And because I want to apply the gradient in full, I'm going to set the opacity, otherwise known as the alpha or transparency, to 100%. And now our gradient in the selector actually matches the ones in the presets. So this is going to be transitioning by default from the foreground color, that's the one in the top left over here, to the background color, that's the red in the background. So let's go ahead and try this. When you left click, you're setting the starting point for the gradient, and wherever you let go is going to be essentially the end point for that gradient. The distance you drag does matter as well as the direction. So if I drag from here to about over there, what you're going to notice is that the direction is basically where the gradient is progressing from. So black down here to the red in the top right hand corner. And depending on the distance of the gradient, whatever is before the distance, so in that case this black corner over here, is going to have the color on the far left in terms of this color bar, and whatever's beyond where the gradient endpoint is going to have the color on the far right, which is this solid red color. And everywhere in between is going to have some proportion of both of those colors. Yes, it's also possible to have more than two colors in a gradient. We'll talk about that in a minute. So to demonstrate, though, how the distance of your gradient matters, I'll just do a very small one here. And what you'll see is that we clearly have this solid red section in the top right, the solid black section in the left and the bottom left, and then there's this middle section where the actual gradient is taking place, the transition from one color to the other. So the larger you want this transition to be, the further you should drag this gradient. And of course the direction matters, so if I drag from the bottom right to the top left, you're going to have the background color in the top left, that's the red, and the foreground color, the black, in the bottom right. So let's quickly demonstrate the other types of gradients that are available to you. Obviously linear gradients are very basic and easy to use. There's also radial gradients, which is going to give you a circle at the starting point, and you drag to basically set the size of that circle. The endpoint doesn't matter as much because here it's the same shape all the way around. So really it's just starting point and distance that matters. You can also come over here to check the reverse option, which in this case will make the background color the inner color. So you get a red dot with the black background. Then there's the angle gradient, which looks a little bit like this. Notice how the gradient goes around your starting point in kind of a clockwise fashion. You can also reverse it to make it go counterclockwise instead. And then we have the reflected gradient, where when you start your gradient, it's actually going to reflect onto both sides. Basically, it's creating a copy of the gradient to whichever side you didn't designate. So if I drag over here with the gradient, it's going to do the exact same gradient on the left-hand side. And then finally, the diamond gradient, very similar to the radial gradient, except we're getting a diamond shape. And the direction you choose does matter a little bit, because it's going to kind of rotate the diamond around. So here, as opposed to the radial gradient, the direction you choose actually matters, because it's going to rotate your diamond gradient around. So depending on where you want all those middle points to kind of jut out, that's going to matter there. And if you want a really big diamond, just drag very far distances on your gradient. Now, of course, you're not limited to just foreground to background color gradients. If we click on this gradient selector, you can see that there's a lot of different presets. You can also find some online if you want to go ahead and look for them, and you can also create your own. So here, let's select a gradient which has many different colors. We'll just choose the spectrum gradient, a bit fun. And what you'll notice when we apply this is we get a lot of different colors transitioning into each other, basically the entire visible light spectrum. As before still, whenever the gradient is over, basically before the starting point and after the end point, we get the end colors for that gradient. In this case, the end color and the start color is solid red. So just note that depending on how much you want this gradient to take part in your overall layer or your overall selection, just drag the more you want that distance to be. Now, I mentioned selection, so I guess we can demonstrate something pretty cool here. Whenever you use a marquee tool, that would be like a rectangular marquee and elliptical marquee, you can select a portion of your document. It doesn't need to be the whole thing. What we can actually do is with that selection, we can apply a gradient inside of just that selection. So here, let's go ahead and do that. And you see that the full image is not basically managed at all by this gradient, but only inside of the portion we select. So you don't have to use the rectangular marquee or elliptical marquee. You could just as easily use the lasso tool and draw some really weird shape there and do the same thing. Now let's show editing a gradient. I'm going to select one a little bit simply here. Let's choose this 4-color gradient here, which is yellow, purple, orange, and then blue. And now if I double click here, it's going to give us the gradient editor. So in the gradient editor, we can do things like remove a color, which you can select a color and then hit delete, or you can actually just drag this down to remove it instantly. You can also click to add in more points of color. Now on top, you have opacity stops or points, and on bottom you have color points. So if we drag these around, it's going to change how our gradient looks. And what you'll notice is that between every 2 points, you also get this middle point section. So, and by default, between 2 of these stops, you're going to get an equal distribution of color because this middle point is in the middle. But if we actually select this diamond and shift it, what you'll notice is that the color distribution between 2 points will start to favor one side or the other. So if you want there to be a lot more purple than orange between these 2 points, you can do that. Let's say over here on the right, you want to make this almost entirely blue. We drag this color selector over, and by doing that, we can get more control over the exact colors of the gradient between 2 stops. Now with opacity, that would be for controlling for transparency. So if you want a point to have partial transparency in a gradient, you can just select here, and then you can drop the opacity down. So when we do that, as the gradient gets closer to that opacity point, it's going to become more and more transparent, meaning that more and more background colors, layers that are below that gradient layer, are going to show through. So if we applied this gradient here, which we'll do in a second, then what would happen is some of the black from the background would show through because that's the only other visible layer. So before we do that though, you want to make sure that the gradient you're working on is actually in this preset pool of gradients so that if you switch to a different gradient at any other time, you don't lose your work on the gradient. So I'm going to hit New here, and that's going to add another gradient option in the presets, and we'll be able to keep working with it as we open up Photoshop documents and start working on new projects. So I'll hit OK here. And in this layer 3, note that layers 2 and 1 are both disabled for visibility. I can just apply this gradient, and as I toggle on the background on and off, you'll see that the background color of black influences the middle section of the gradient, because there's partial transparency, which means that the black in the background shows through, making the overall image darker in those areas. So I could do the same thing with white as well. So let's actually demonstrate that really quick. If we had a white background, it would look something like this. Now, if you have a gradient that has transparency in the editor, but you don't want to apply that transparency, you can just come over here to the transparency option, uncheck that, and apply it again. And even though the gradient in the editor has transparency, it doesn't actually apply when we put it on our Photoshop document. So the best way I've found if you want to create a new gradient or just override another one is to select the old gradient that you want to edit from. Make your changes as you see fit, so I'm just removing a couple key points here. And right-click the old gradient, hit delete, and then hit new with the same name. And then that basically is going to effectively replace the one that already existed in the presets. So now we can hit OK. The old one is gone, and we only have the new preset, which should stick there as we start new Photoshop documents so that we can use it in anything we're working on. So all that put aside, that's pretty much all you need to know about gradients in Photoshop CC 2018. So I've been Chris, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in my future video content. Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I wanted to show you guys the difference between stroke and drop shadow inside of Photoshop and how to apply both effects. So in order to apply either drop shadow or stroke inside of Photoshop, it's pretty intuitive. You right-click on the layer you want to apply the effect to. You go up to Blending Options, and here you have a series of different tools you can apply onto your text here. You can also use this on image layers and other items, by the way. It doesn't have to be text. So let's go ahead and enable this right here. You can see that we have a red color there. I'm going to change it to something a little less annoying. So using the color picker tool. So here I'll make it more of a deep blue. Increase the size, and depending on how your size is, you'll be able to see it more and more. If we make this color a little bit lighter, it should be easier to see. So you can tell, by default at least, it's a solid colored line that goes all the way around your text. The inner borders and the outer borders for letters like R that would actually have it inside. By default, it's 100% opacity. You can lower that down if you don't want it to be entirely visible and you want to let some of the background fade in. You also have this position tool. By default, it's set to inside, which means taking the base character of the text, you're actually stroking on the inner lines, which means you're overwriting part of the original text area. If you change that to outside, it's going to put it basically on the black parts, so any area that was already outside of the original text size. You'll notice by doing that, though, it does make it very large and blocky, and you may even get some overlap, depending on how high you set your stroke size. And then there's center, which gives you half on the black area and then half on the actual text. So that's stroke. Let's go over to drop shadow. So blending options. So let's add in the drop shadow effect. And depending on your settings, you should see kind of a blurred out image of the original text behind your text. So let's go ahead and add in the drop shadow effect. So when you have a drop shadow, it's got an angle, which is kind of the direction that the drop shadow is going out in. A distance, how big you want the drop shadow to be, or how far do you want the drop shadow to travel. You also have the spread, where if we increase this, there will be more size for your drop shadow effect. Now when you increase the spread, it increases it without increasing the size of the blur. But when you increase the size, you'll notice that the blur effect also enlarges, not just the size of the drop shadow. Now this is a linear drop shadow, and by the way, the default color for a drop shadow is usually black, because shadows are of course black or some shade of gray. But you can really have the drop shadow in any color, just like you can with the stroke. The difference is, you have an angle. It doesn't go strictly around the outer edges of your text, but it's got both the direction and the blur. Right now we're looking at a linear drop shadow, which has its strongest in the center, and then it blurs as it gets to the outer edges. But if you click on the contour down here, you're actually able to get some interesting effects. So if we change this from linear to cone, it gives you a very different distribution of color and lighting for your drop shadow effect. And there's a lot of different options on here. So you can come down here, try some of these out, and see if you get a more interesting drop shadow effect than just the simple linear drop shadow. And of course, for any of these points on the curve, you can modify them. Now, technically speaking, like the normal stroke, you can increase the opacity to 100, which brings it actually quite similar to the stroke, except you still have that slight blur on the outer edges. You still have the control of the contour to give you very different looks than what you might have in a basic stroke. And then the angle controls what direction the drop shadow effect is going to be taking place in. Just to show one more cool effect down here, noise, you can add this if you want to get a very staticky looking effect on your drop shadow text. Probably not going to be commonly used, but it's another option that's available for you guys there. But just quickly going back to stroke, you can see that there are only a few settings here really, so strokes are for much simpler effects. When you don't want blur, you don't need an angle, you just want it to statically go around the edges of your text with a single color in an equal distribution. So that pretty much covers the differences between stroke and drop shadow in the context of Photoshop and how to use them. So I've been Chris, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in my future Photoshop content. Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how we can use and define custom shapes inside of Photoshop. So, to actually draw in a shape in Photoshop, you come down here to what's by default the rectangular tool, and you can change this to the custom shape tool. Now when you're in the custom shape tool, you're going to have one of many different shapes that you can draw from. And if you click over here, you'll see the default shapes that exist in Photoshop CC 2018, including arrows, music notes, puppy feet, and copyright symbols. So when you find one that you like, you can simply select it. Make sure that you have the colors you want to draw the shape in selected in the foreground color. And then you simply drag the shape to the dimensions that you want, let go, and you hit OK. And then your shape's going to be created. Now, that's how you would create a shape that already exists. But in order to define a custom shape, we need to use the pen tool. You might notice that when we do stretch these shapes out, it's actually conforming to a path. You see all of these path points here, the little blue squares? Well, we can create our own shape path and convert that into a custom shape pretty easily. So next we want to go over to the pen tool, where we'll be able to create a path for our next shape. I'll create a new layer for this path, and let's go ahead and start defining something. So I'm going to make a very simple shape here. I'll just kind of create a diamond here. I'm not really worrying about getting the dimensions exactly right. So once you have the initial shape how you want it, or the path for the shape rather, you simply right-click on the path and you choose Define Custom Shape. So when we save this as a custom shape, I'll just call this one Diamond. You can see it does need a little bit of work there, but the general concept stays the same. And once you've defined that custom shape, you can now go down to the Custom Shape tool, and you'll be able to find the shape you just created inside of the drop down. And now I can create these diamond shapes using the tool as much as we want in any size that we want, but conforming to the same basic shape no matter how big we create it or in which width or height dimensions we create it with. So that's basically how you use custom shapes and define your own custom shapes to use in a nutshell. I've been Chris, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in my future Photoshop content. Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I'll be showing you how to remove acne from a person's face using the healing brush tools. So over on the left in the tools window, right above the classical brush, you have the healing brush, if we right click here, and the spot healing brush tools. These two tools are almost identical, except that with the healing brush tool, you're basically kind of copying from one area where you would have perfect skin into an area where you would have imperfect skin, whereas with the spot healing brush tool, Whereas with the Spot Healing Brush tool, it's going to take information from the areas around your problem area, the acne, and use that area to figure out which colors it should be making the acne become, basically the skin color of the rest of the face. So we'll start by using the Healing Brush tool here. With the Healing Brush tool, we should hit Alt to find a spot where we have good skin. So you left click, and then that's basically using it as the anchor point. And then we find a spot where we have a problem, like the acne, and we start drawing on it. And you can see that as I draw with the brush, it's actually taking the information directly from another part of the face. Now, this can be a really good way to get rid of acne, but note that since it is basically copying the information from one area to another part of your face, if you do it too often, it might become obvious that that is not the original part of the face. So it's a good idea to sample from different areas in order to get better results. So here we can apply some acne fixes over there. Maybe we sample the cheek up here in order to kind of fix down there a little bit. And there likewise as well. Now with the Spot Healing Brush tool, it's more targeted at making really small fixes. So for instance, here you could say, oh, this looks a little bumpy, so we want to kind of fix that. So if we draw over here with the healing brush and make sure that we cover the area where we're trying to fix, it'll sample the areas that we actually have selected and making it look more uniform, making bumps go away and making acne go away. So let's just kind of try that there, and you can see it makes it a lot more level. You do lose some of the detail because it's kind of blurring and meshing the colors together. But if what you're trying to go for is a perfect looking face, then these are the tools that are going to be helping you out. So here we also have some wrinkles. We can work on that. Spot Healing Brush. Just be careful you don't go too overboard with it. If you have any doubts, step back, make sure that whatever fixes you're applying here aren't too obvious that they are fake. And we can try to get that wrinkle too, for fun. Yep, and let's just keep applying a little more till we get it. And just by using those tools, we've basically removed a couple of the wrinkles and some of the acne. Next, let's come down here to work on this big acne. So I'm going to use the main healing brush because we're dealing with something large. So here I'm going to sample from the area over here using the main healing brush. And we'll try to overwrite this a bit and see how that goes. Pretty easy, actually. And let's get there a bit. Here as well. And that's definitely an improvement. We could use the Spot Healing Brush to come make some very minor changes as well. And that's not too bad. So let's just do the neck real quick, and then we'll call it a video. So Healing Brush, I'm going to sample from, let's say, this part of the neck up here. Because of shadows, it might actually make more sense to go from over here, so that the color is more consistent. And we'll sample for this part of the neck as well. If you want, you can also spend some extra time working on these small areas where you have a bit of inconsistent skin color. So note that because no one really has absolutely perfect skin, if you do go all the way and trying to make the skin flawless, it will become more and more obvious that it's a bit photoshopped. But you can go as far as you want with it. I think this is pretty decent compared to the original. So let's just do a quick before and after. So this is now, and that was before. So you can see how these Photoshop tools are really good for making improvements on things like acne. I've been Chris, thanks for watching this video, and I will see you guys in my future video content. Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to take a Photoshop document and to selectively change the color of anything you want basically inside of your photo. So in this case I'm changing the color of the shirt from blue to green or blue to whatever color. And how we do that is a combination of a hue saturation adjustment layer and a layer mask. So to add in a hue adjustment layer, we go to the adjustments window here. If you don't see that, you can go to Windows and then open Adjustments window. So let's see here, hue saturation. And now what I'm going to do to get started is I'm just going to change the hue, which currently is targeting the entire document. And just try to get the color right for the shirt, since that's what we're actually concerned with. You don't need to worry about anything else in the document, because as we add in a layer mask, it's only going to affect the shirt, and everything else will be back to the original color. Now, once you have your hue selected, go ahead and make sure that you have the layer mask selected. Not the hue saturation, but the layer mask itself. If you have the layer mask selected in the properties window, it'll show masks and say. Now, in some cases, if you're working with one solid color, you might be able to get lucky and use what's called the magic wand tool, which if you click on a color, it's going to try to select every color bordering that has the same color. However, in this particular case, I'm going to advise against it, because as you see, when we add in tolerance, it's not actually covering every little detail here. Whenever you change it to a new tolerance level, you should click again to get the magic wand to do a reselection. But here I'm actually going to advise against using the magic wand. It does work well in some cases, but here it's picking up some of these leaves on the side, and if we use the magic wand, it would get a bit messy. So instead, you can either use the lasso tool to select big regions here, or you can just do everything by hand with the brush, which ultimately, if you actually take the time to do it, will give you the best results. To make things a little quicker here, I'm going to get started using the lasso tool, and then follow up with the brush tool. Now, in your foreground and background colors, you should have white and black selected. Black is going to be the areas where you are applying the layer mask on, and then white is the area you're actually removing it from. However, what we're going to do when we're done with this layer mask is invert it. So really, when we're drawing black, that's going to be the areas that show, the areas which are not going to have a layer mask, and then everything else is going to end up being basically the part that is not getting this hue saturation adjustment layer applied to it. You'll see what I mean in a minute. So with the lasso tool, I'm going to cut out large chunks of easily selectable material from our photo here. I'm not going to go to the edges with the lasso tool because I don't want to accidentally select parts that aren't going to be included in the layer. So with that big region selected, I'm just going to use the paint bucket tool, fill in color black, and right there, that's returning it back to its original color, but remember, we're inverting it. And I'm going to use the lasso tool over here to achieve the same result. As with a lot of things inside of Photoshop, the more time you spend with it, the better your result is going to be. So then we take out another big chunk, and we can keep going with the lasso tool until we get pretty close to selecting the borders. Okay, so I'm going to stop there with the lasso tool, especially because I'm doing this with a mouse and not a drawing tablet. And now I'm going to switch to the paintbrush tool, where everything else that's still green on the shirt, we want to return that to the blue color. So here, I'm going to increase the size of the brush so that we can make this a little bit quicker. And we just have to carefully go over the edges here and return the color to blue. Now, of course, there will be quicker ways to do this, but in general, you're not going to get as good of results as if you are carefully doing this by hand with the brush tool. For instance, for these areas up here, we could try the magic wand, and it actually gives us a pretty good selection. So we might use the magic wand to fill in gaps like that, lowering the tolerance down if you need to. And we'll do one more over there. But you will come across areas where the colors are just too similar, and therefore using the magic wand is going to give you bad results. So we'll see if the magic wand will work over here. Not that well. If we lower the tolerance down, maybe we'll get better results. We can start with that, so let's try that. These areas where it's not quite selecting properly, you get some green laying behind, and that's one of the reasons the brush tool is good, because you can have it be 100% thick, and honestly, we should be using the brush with 100% hardness, though it won't make too big of a difference here. So, if you run into any minor details, like here, you can always lower the brush size down to get more precision over how it's going to look. So really, it mostly comes down to a matter of taking your time with it and trying to get the best results you can. So, just going to wrap up this last part over here. If you do need to correct any of your mistakes, you can always switch to the white brush. So now what we're going to do here is double click on the layer mask, and we can either hit invert here, which is just going to swap the layer mask with what we've selected before, or as an alternative you can select from the indicates drop down. Instead of masked areas, you choose selected areas, which would give you the same kind of result. Here I'm just going to invert it though, because that's what we said we were going to do at the start. Another useful tool we might want to use in here is called the Refine Edge Brush tool. With this, Photoshop will try to kind of automatically figure out the edges here. So here it's really clear that this area, which actually has a little mask on the outside of the shirt, so we can kind of draw over that, and it will try to smooth out the difference between the shirt and the outer areas. So you can apply that to some of these outer areas, just kind of smooth it out a bit. And when you're satisfied here, just go ahead and hit OK, and the layer mask should be complete. So it looks like earlier outside of the layer mask editor, we missed a couple spots here, so I'm going to go ahead and select those here. To be honest, if you feel like it, you could probably do all your layer mask editing in this editor rather than the standard one, if you prefer that instead. But either will work fine for most of what you need to do. So that looks pretty good here. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And now that the inversion has been complete, we have changed the color of this man's shirt from blue to green. But even better, because we did it using layers, we can easily change that shirt again to any color we want just by moving it along the spectrum. So the shirt is now whatever color we want it to be, which is super awesome. So I've been Chris, thanks for watching. I hope you guys found this tutorial useful, and I will see you guys later in my future Photoshop content. Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I want to show you how in Photoshop we can revert any changes we've made since a document is open and go back to any point in time by using the history panel. Now in order to open up the history panel, if you don't see this icon right here in the sidebar to the right of the main frame, we can go to Windows and History, which will open up this sidebar. Now if we want to make this basically extended on the full section down here, with history selected we can click on these two arrows, if that's available there. And now we're working solely with the history from top to bottom in this section. So what you're going to see here is a list of all the changes you've made since your document has been open, all the way going back to when your document was actually opened. So if you want to go back to the very start immediately without closing out your app and reopening it, you can just click on the open history and it'll go back to how the document was when you opened it back up. Anywhere in between, you just click on the history section you want, and it will immediately pop you back to that point in time. So if we want to go back to the current history, we just click down here. Now, it's worth noting, if you go back to a certain history point and you start making changes, these new changes are going to be deleted. So be careful. Make sure that when you actually go back to a point in your history, that you're okay with losing all of the work that's past that before you actually make changes here on the document. So I want to show one more way that we can use history tools inside of Photoshop. So something called the history brush allows us to basically draw on a layer that we have selected in the layers panel. Using the history brush, we are basically drawing data from a previous point in history. So for instance, if I wanted to revert things back to the initial image here, this books.jpg file, and we select the history brush by actually pressing Y on our keyboard, or by going down here to the bottom, which will by default look like these three dots are at a toolbar. And if we right click that and go down to the history brush tool, we can also select it in the same way. And with this layer, we can basically revert back to a previous point in the document. So by basically dragging and drawing here, we're taking this layer and literally pasting the data from a previous point in history onto that layer. Now, the advantage of using the history brush tool is that A, you can put it onto a single layer rather than reverting your entire document, and B, as you can see it being a brush, you can revert only part of your document basically whatever you draw on will be reverted to that previous point, rather than reverting every single pixel. Just be careful which layer you actually choose to revert the history onto, because regardless of what data was on that layer, it's now going to be overwritten by that history data. So aside from the traditional Control-Z for undo, or going up to the edit menu and hitting undo, the old-fashioned way of reverting history, that's just about everything you need to know about reverting your history inside of Photoshop CC 2018. So I hope this video has been useful for you guys. I've been Chris, and I will see you guys in my future Photoshop tutorials. Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I'm going to be showing you guys how we can apply a gradient over text inside of Photoshop. So assuming that you've already gone ahead and created text using the text tool over in the tools window, what we do is we find the layer where our text is located at in our layers panel. That's by default in the bottom right. We right click it and we go to blending options in the top left. Here you have a list of different things you can apply to your text, including things like stroking the outside of the text, but further down is a gradient overlay. So if we actually check this, you'll notice that there is a slight gradient already applied to it, but we can select any gradient we choose by clicking on the gradient dropdown, and then we can go over to a preset that we've created earlier, or we can create an entirely new gradient here. So essentially you just choose the gradient you want, make whatever changes you need to. So opacity stops up on top, color stops down on bottom, change the colors, change the positions as you need. When you're done, hit OK. And if you want it to look different than it does right now, but with those colors, you can modify the angle so that the gradient is starting and ending at different positions on your text. You can also change the style of the gradient. So a radial gradient, that gives you a circle at the center of the gradient. Angle has a clockwise rotation from the starting point. Reflected will give you the same gradient on both sides of the starting point, so you have a gradient going from the starting point to the top left here and to the top bottom, of course, also modifiable by angle. And diamond gradients, which are very, very similar to the radial gradient, except instead of a circular shape, you have a diamond shape. So, of course, any other blending options you want to combine this with, like drop shadow or a stroke, you're welcome to do so. So here, if I want to add like a red stroke to the outside, we can just check this to add it on, modify the size, modify the color, and you'd be good to go. So that's basically all you need to know about how to add a gradient onto your text inside of Photoshop CC 2018. I've been Chris, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in my future Photoshop content. Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how we can blur out a background very efficiently inside of Photoshop CC 2018. So in order to separate the parts that we want to blur from the parts we don't want to blur, we should use the lasso tool that's available up here on the top left. If you needed a much less precise tool for selection, you could use rectangular marquee or elliptical marquee, but the lasso tool just gives you way more control. So let's say in this instance we wanted to take this guy and make sure he is the item that's not blurred out. All we need to do is use the lasso tool and draw roughly around him, taking as much or as little time as we need to get a decent shape here. And just go all the way around until we can complete a circuit. And once you've done that, we've isolated that guy from the rest of the document. Now, if we used a blur tool or blur filter at this point, it would only be applying to this person. So we want to invert that. So you can go up to the select menu and choose inverse or shift control I on your keyboard. And now if we go down here to the blur tool, for image this size I would recommend that you do increase the size quite a bit here so that it's going to blur very heavily in a lot of area all at once. We can just kind of start blurring by left clicking and holding it down without any fear of accidentally blurring out the person that we don't want to blur out. So basically, we've just made that person immune to blur, and we can go crazy with the rest of our image. Now that might take a while though, so an even quicker way would be to use a blur filter. So if we go up to Filter, Blur, and typically you would do a Gaussian blur as the most basic type of blur. You'd come in here, you can see the preview, and note that in this preview, you can see the person still being completely unblurred. And depending on how much or how little blur you want, you increase the pixels to get it more blurred out. And once you're done, you hit OK. So we easily were able to blur out the background in just a few short minutes. If you wanted to, say, keep all of these people around, you could just use the lasso tool and try to cut around the people instead. Also a less effective way, but if you have less colors going on in your photo, you could also do select color range to target specific color areas in your document. But lasso tool is what I would normally recommend, so that's going to be it for this video. I've been Chris, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in my future Photoshop content. Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how using layer masks we can remove color from everything in a photo while maintaining color in specific areas such as lips, eyes, or parts of clothing. You can also use the same technique with hair, but it's much more difficult to get it to work precisely because of all the strands, naturally. So in order to get started here, we're going to go to the adjustments window over here and create a new hue saturation layer. We're going to drop down the saturation to nothing, and as you can see, this hue saturation layer has a layer mask where everything in the entire image is affected, and we want to subtract from that layer mask in order to get our desired effect. So in order to edit the layer mask, I'm going to double click on the layer mask thumbnail, and here it's going to give us the layer mask editing mode, where we have a few tools available to us, namely lasso tool, brush tool, and refine edge brush tool. Now, because we're working with pretty precise areas and we want to get a pretty good result, I'm going to recommend against using the lasso tool here. And instead we're just going to jump straight to the brush. And because we are subtracting from a layer mask, we want to hit the negative sign up here. And before we get started with this, I want to increase the transparency to 100% so that when we actually subtract from the layer mask, we'll be able to see all of the color. Now let's zoom in a bit. You can do that by hitting Z to use the zoom tool, and then Alt to change from a negative to a plus. I'm going to go back to the brush tool, and I'm going to increase the brush size a little bit. 16 pixels, that looks okay. We'll zoom in a little bit more. You can also control a middle mouse wheel in order to do that. And you essentially just target the areas you want to bring the color back in and apply the brush there. Now, for eyes, you can either do it for the whole eye, or you can just do the pupils. I think the pupils are more popular because, no one really wants to look at all the veins and stuff that exist in an eye. So let's go do the other eye real quick. And with something like an eyeball, it's pretty simple. Now, it does look like I got a little bit sloppy there, so if we zoom in further and maybe decrease this brush size, with the Refine Edge brush tool, we can target some of these different color changes without affecting the color we want to keep. So if I kind of take this brush here and apply adding in the layer mask back a little bit, we get a better result, and it doesn't really affect the eye color of the pupil, which is kind of what we're looking for here, and looks like we can do a little bit over there too. Alternatively, you can just use the normal brush and hit shift to go into positive mode, and make sure you just get any of those yellow areas that you don't want in the pupil, while trying to get the entire pupil to show through with all of its color. Now, the eyes are pretty simple. Let's move on to the lips. So, because she has red lips, we should only see red here. So anything like that, we're trying to dodge, and any red, that's a good thing. But just to show, I'm going to be a little bit sloppy here intentionally. And you can see that there's a color difference here. So let's use the Refine Edge brush tool to add some of that layer mask back in, while not adding in layer mask to the red. So I'm just going to kind of haphazardly go here with the layer mask. And you can see, as we draw over it, we get rid of some of that orange, but pretty much the red is unaffected. Because the Refine Edge brush tool basically takes this starting color and tries to work around that. Now, as you can see, it's not exactly perfect, so in some cases you might need to use the regular brush anyway, especially to get ideal results. and just kind of get a little bit more manual with that. So let's continue getting the full lips. And you know what, we'll just add the whole lips back in, and then we will work on the edges. Okay, so I'll start with the size of brush, and I'll change back from the negative to a positive, and we'll try to get all these orange areas removed here, which is what we don't want. You can also use the Refine Edge brush. In this case, I'm calling anything that's kind of orange as undesirable for what we're trying to go for here in this final image. Okay, so if we zoom out, that's pretty good. Not 100% perfect, but if you're at a distance, it would be pretty hard to tell. So let's also do this dress piece down here as well. So because this is a little bit more of a solid shape that's easy to work with, we could use the lasso tool here. So what I'll do is I will hold Alt down to make it a subtracting lasso, removing from the layer mask. And we'll try to draw a rough shape here. Of course, the more stable you are, the better your result is going to be. And you could do this with a drawing tablet as well. Currently, I'm using a mouse, and that's why it's a little bit unstable. So with that, not too bad. It looks like the dress actually didn't really have that much color in the original image. Before we finish, we'll double check on that though. So, to kind of clean that up, I'm going to use the plus tool with the brush to get rid of any edges that might be sticking out here. Just kind of working my way up. Here it actually looks like we might need to use the subtract tool a little bit to get more color from the actual dress in there. And that's going to be not too bad. So if we zoom out here, we have color in the eyes, color in the lips, color in the dress, although you can't really tell. So we can go ahead and hit OK here. And now the new layer mask is applied over our base image. To show what it looked like before, I'll disable this layer and we can see the original image. Now in this case, for the final results, I think I would actually just subtract this area altogether from the layer mask. It doesn't look very good without the color of the original image. So we'll just have the eyes and the lips there. So let's actually just go double click on the layer mask to make one more edit. And I'll use the plus lasso this time to just do a broad stroke around that dress area. Select it, and in a couple seconds, that area is now no color again. So that's going to be it for making everything in your image black and white while maintaining color in a few key areas. I've been Chris, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in my future Photoshop content. Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I'm going to be showing you guys 3 ways to take a totally cute and normal image and to turn it into something intense or quite scary, depending on how you look at it. So the first way is what's called color inversion. When we look at the image as it is right now, we have totally normal greens, natural colors that you would see on a sheet like white. But what happens if you flip everything in the image around? Well, if we go over to the adjustments window, there's an option called invert here, which will create a new inversion layer basically on top of our original image. So just by clicking invert, you can see that you can take any normal image and turn it demonic with literally the click of a button. Now, you don't have to apply this in full. You could, of course. The second option, which gives us similar results, but maybe not quite as intensely, is going up to the filter menu and then going down to stylize and then solarize. So you can see that there's a lot of the same color changes in that effect, but some areas, such as the natural greens in the background, are left alone. So depending on your image, you might get results you like more using solarize rather than the inversion of color. But let's go talk about the third option, which is to use the posturize effect, also in the adjustments layer. So if we posturize on top of the background layer, you'll notice that it takes the colors and makes them very, very intense. But we can actually increase this even further by dragging the posturize level over all the way to the left until we're at 2. And the sheep looks very intense, but in a way that's different than the normal color inversion. Now, depending on how much you want this effect to be taking place, you can lower it down quite a lot to make it a more normal image. But that's going to be 3 ways you can take a totally normal image and turn it into something intense or just downright scary. So that's going to be it for this video. I've been Chris, and I'll see you guys in my future Photoshop content. Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to do a daytime to nighttime conversion inside of Photoshop. So this will be the end result, and this is what we're starting with. So clearly it's the day here, and we change it into night by applying a few filters and adding in some stars in the night sky. So the first thing I'm going to do is go over here to the adjustments window, and I'm going to add in brightness/contrast as an adjustment layer. And we're going to lower the brightness way down. I have it at about 106 in the other photo, so it's a good starting place for the rest of our filters. Next, we're going to add in a levels adjustment layer, and rather than just have a full mask that applies to everything on the screen, I'm actually going to come over here to the gradients tool, and we're going to do a white to black gradient, so make sure that's your foreground and background colors here. And we're going to apply the gradient, basically from the top towards the bottom, so that when we adjust the lighting in this image, it's mostly going to be affecting up here at the top, because as you can see, the sky is way too bright. It's clearly still day. And we need to lower that down, but we don't want to remove too much lighting from the car, because we still want to be able to see that. So click on the levels adjustment over here in the layers, and I'm going to take the levels here, and I'm just going to drag it over to the right. So about 0.45 looks good there. Basically taking these colors and making them a little bit darker. You may also find that you want to reapply the gradient starting in endpoints to get a little bit more of the background to be affected there, so I'll make it roughly... So I'll make the white area roughly 50-60% of the image as it gets down there towards the bottom. Next, I'm going to add in a channel mixer, and I'm going to leave this output channel defaulting as red. But I'm actually going to lower the red down to about 65 or 60. And on top of that, to kind of counteract how much blue there is now, we're going to add in a photo filter, and I'm going to set that to red, which brings our overall color a lot more into a grayish blue that we might see in the night. Now lastly, we're going to need some stars, so I'm going to create a new layer here, and I'm going to pull this image from my desktop into here, which is just a star background that we can use. I'll stretch the image as much as you think you need. Hit OK, and with that, we're going to want to make sure that it doesn't completely override the image behind it, so we need to apply a blending filter. So right-click and go to Blending Options, and where it says Blend If Gray, you're going to want to pull the left-hand endpoint over so that whatever's black, basically the empty space, is not going to show up in the final image. Also, these stars are showing too fully, especially with this amount of light still out. You would not be able to see the stars that well, so I'm going to lower the fill opacity down quite a bit. So that the stars are more faded in the background. And now I want to cut all the stars that would be impossible to see here underneath the skyline out. So I'm going to use the lasso tool, and I'm just going to kind of roughly draw a line somewhere above the skyline here, go down to the bottom, the left, and the top. And with all this area, I'm just going to hit delete. Okay, first we apparently need to rasterize the layer, so I'm going to right-click Rasterize Layer, and now we're going to hit delete on that. So there's no stars where there shouldn't be stars. To further make the image more gray rather than blue, we also want to take the photo filter and increase the density of the red filter. So if we put that up to about 65-70%, it's going to look a lot more of a natural night. Also, if we want to take this top area where we have the levels layer adjusted and make it even darker, we can take the left side of the levels and move that over. Then if we want to take this blue area, we can also adjust that further. Kind of as far as you want to go with this. You could choose to go all the way and make it like a pitch black night, but that seems a bit overkill for what the original image was going for. So when you get your brightness and your levels adjusted to pretty much exactly where you want it to be, you'll be able to call it good. So obviously the colors of the car are really faded from here, and you can't really tell much about this guy down here. So if you want, you can also go into the layer mask for the brightness contrast and make it so that that brightness decrease doesn't affect down here as much as well. So I'm going to drag a gradient down just like we did for the levels layer. And by doing that, we can brighten up the area down here. But obviously that looks a little bit ridiculous. You can tell that the lighting is really unnatural there. So I'm going to decrease the intensity of that by lowering the density of the layer mask way, way, way down. And with all those changes, I'd say we've successfully turned a daytime image into nighttime. You can play around with it a little bit more to get the settings exactly how you like them. But let's just show a before after here. So there's before, obviously in the morning, and we apply these filters, and we get something of a nighttime image. So I've been Chris, I hope you found this tutorial useful, and I will see you guys in my future Photoshop content.